Hello, my name is Edward Cohn. I'm a transpersonal psychotherapist and dual diagnosis clinician. So today I want to talk a little bit about some of the broader areas of how I would look at addiction from a clinical treatment point of view and through a theoretical viewpoint of looking at addiction from a way outside of the standard disease model. So one of the ways that I consider what people present with me with their issues of addiction when they come in to see me is that they're caught up in a behavior that they can't stop. And as much as they try to, as much as they want to, the behavior continues to repeat in a way that they don't have control over it. And that really is the basics of what you see person-to-person presentation-wise. Now, clearly for individuals, this creates a lot of distress. It creates a lot of concern with themselves, family members, partners, and whoever may be involved in their lives, and obviously with themselves. So when I'm dealing with an addiction and someone's behavioural issues with their behavioural issue, whether it's alcohol, drugs, internet, pornography, whatever it might be, what I see is a commonality that runs through all of these issues with each individual. And very simplest way of seeing what this is or describing what it is that you're seeing someone who's carrying a lot of emotional stress. And the emotional stress is built up in their system. And when that peaks and that stress becomes too much, there's an acting out behavior, which is the trigger response in the person's mind, which suggests that they should go and buy a drink or buy some cocaine or use pornography or act out in some sort of way. It comes from an internal impulse, and that's what we call the trigger. So this is something which is happening then neurologically inside of their heads. And what you see is that this is being emotionally driven. And not being able to catch that, not being able to see it, means it will extend out in their behavior, and that's why I refer to it as being acted out. That impulse and that drive and that suggestion gets acted out in the behavior. And what you're then seeing is that deeper feeling of that stress or discomfort or negative feeling usually is not being able to be contained by the person, and it's not able to be processed by the person. So once you start to notice that people are presenting this very similar sort of behavior and similar sort of feeling state, what you're really looking at then is an issue of emotional dysregulation, the inability to process predominantly negative emotional states. Now, this is actually far more common than people would recognize. And when you have that combined with a learned behavior, i.e. learning to use drugs, learning to use the internet, learning to use pornography, learning to drink, which is something that will be learned much earlier in life, usually around adolescence. You have these things, two things combining together. And neurologically, really what's happening is the impulse allows the behavior to be acted out and therefore discharged. In other words, the inner tension gets released and it gets played out in behavior, and that dissipates that inner tension. So the way of emotionally regulating is by discharging the emotion. And that's happening impulsively. And the person feels as though they're not in that behavior from a choice-making process. And that is the distress. And being caught up in that is the difficulty and the helplessness that they're experiencing. And that imbalance, if you like, is what you could say is the disease. If you were to consider that from the standard medical model, that is the disease of addiction. It is that behavioural acting out around that substance, around that behaviour, that mechanism that can't be contained. it can't be stopped, and it creates fallout and destruction in that person's life. That basically are the elements of the addiction. So what I'm saying is happening is that is a problem of the inability for emotions to be processed within the central nervous system by the person. And as a result of them not being able to do that and not involved in their emotional processing capabilities, the emotion gets discharged into the environment through behavior. And this is a way that the central nervous system maintains itself, but is an aberration of the way that it should be doing it. So in other words, you could say it's an adaptive way of doing it when the central nervous system isn't being regulated properly. And that adaptation is something that it needs to do to make sure that emotional intensity, the emotional valence or valence of that person in their central nervous system doesn't become damaging to the brain, the central nervous system, and the body. So in a similar way that your body regulates blood temperature, your body also regulates emotional intensity. And it will do that in any way that it needs to survive. So why would this be happening in this way for one person and seemingly not happening in this way for another person? Well, the answer to that is probably much more common across people in general than what you might consider to be the way that it should be or that you would imagine it to be. My clinical experience shows me that this is a common type of behavior for people generally across the board. But for some people, it is more of an issue than others. But emotional dysregulation, the inability to process particularly negative emotions, is actually extremely common across the board. And it's one of the issues that people with ongoing anxiety and depression are effectively suffering with. So there's something that's happening here in the ability and know-how and understanding that people have about their emotional inner world. And there's a disconnect around their emotional inner world and their ability to process those emotions as part of their internal emotional and cognitive functioning. And it's in that lack of ability internally that you have then this adaptive system that the central nervous system will do in order to maintain its survival. And essentially really what that is, it's an absence of that learning embedded in the person's behavior that means that the central nervous system needs to fall back in its default system in order to emotionally regulate and maintain its equilibrium. So to understand this in a little bit more detail, what you need to understand is that the brain processes emotions and is designed to process emotion and is designed to process information. And deep emotional structures are embedded in the right hemisphere of the brain. And those emotional structures, they are deeply rooted into your body, and your body is an instrument of the emotional regulation through your right hemisphere. Now, most people are not in tune with this. In a modern society, we are much more left brain dominant. And what does that mean? What that means is we live in a very logical world. We live in a very practical world. We live in a world which is very scientific. It's very object orientated. And it's very much focused on what is external to us. And those are the things which are processed by the left hemisphere. And by contrast, the right hemisphere processes deep emotion. It processes things on a wider, bigger picture frame. And it is also related to interpersonal dynamics with people, in the sense of it recognizes facial movements, facial cues, and interpersonal detail of what helps us intuitively sense of what's going on in another human being. And that deep activity of the right hemisphere in managing and monitoring that happens quite unconsciously. So people, unless they're aware of that and tuned into that, effectively really take it for granted. And predominantly, they live their lives then in this rational, focused, object-orientated, externalized world. In other words, they don't really have much awareness of what's going on inside of them. And they certainly don't have any way of really understanding that to themselves. So what I see clinically is addiction arises in the middle of that imbalance, which is in the neurological structure of the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, and the individual's inability to understand or be tuned into their internal world as well as their external world. So in other words, there's no internal governance. And your brain and the balancing of your brain between the right and left hemisphere requires for there to be internal governance. In the absence of that internal governance, it will go into a default process and it will regulate itself on a default level. And what I hypothesize is that is really what's happening in addiction. It's a combination of a learned behavior as well as emotional regulation that should be happening as a process with the individual and their neurology and their central nervous system and the higher and lower and deeper structures of their brain. And that would bring about emotional regulation, it would bring about self-awareness and understanding, and it would bring a different sort of governance over behavior. In the absence of that, what you have is a lack of knowledge, a central nervous system that needs to regulate itself, and a method through which high-intensity emotions can be discharged. And this is what I consider creates a pathological behavior. And that addiction, therefore, is the pathological behavior. It is an acting out of something which is an imbalance. It's an acting out of something which is destructive. And it is not an integrated way of doing that, which would be a healthy structure. Therefore, I call it pathological. So I treat the person as well as I treat the behavior. And I treat that in the context of themselves in the context of their external environment and their day-to-day life. So you cannot remove the person from themselves, and you cannot remove the self from the environment. You need to treat these things simultaneously. And what I am doing in my methodology is I am aiding and abetting and resetting that emotional regulation system, which is tied to right brain, left brain functioning, and then from the higher prefrontal cortex, through the cortex, into the limbic system, and into the brainstem. You're bringing out integration neurologically in the central nervous system structures, and that brings integration to the person. And you are educating that person how to do that. You're walking them through a process whilst also balancing that with external dynamics of what are required to bring a sense of balance and know-how to their functioning. And that is how I look at resetting the person's neurology, placing that person into their environment from a more aware and attuned and educated way, and walking them through that over a period of time where it's being practiced, it's being reflected upon, it's being built up as a healthy, integrated way of being that enables them then to learn what is something that they should have been able to do before but weren't. When I work like this with people, it is quite amazing how quickly the results can happen. And also what's quite amazing is how similar the results are time-wise, person to person. What I mean by that is individuals seem to go through the same process changes at a relatively similar time frame. And what that tells me in feedback is that there is something organically that's happening in that process, as it's happening with different people, which is tuning into those neurological structures. They know how they are designed to work together, and they're designed to work harmoniously, and they reset naturally in that when they are guided in the correct way. So that observation of timeline and people hitting milestones through that, and me knowing what those milestones are, tell me that there is an organic process that is happening in their recovery, and enables me to track that process with them, and enables me to get a tight biological cue, as well as sociological cues, as well as content cues of what that person is talking to me about, which all align to give a totally integrative experience of that person, neurologically, psychologically, sociologically. So this is what you call a bio-psycho-social integrative model. And I've learned to do this through doing long-term therapy with people for 10, 15 years, working in different fields of addiction practice, going back, working with many years ago with deep psychoactive stimulatory plants which have anti-addictive properties, working in long-term psychotherapy with people with dual diagnosis and alcohol issues, and then in more recent years working in private practice, refining that work to put it into a model that can work with people who want reliable results that make sense to them, that they can apply in a therapeutic setting, which then they can see results from. And that is the method in which I currently work. And it's a combination of all of those years put into a relatively slick model, which is actually a practical approach. So this is what I do in my treatment practice. And it's very different from standard ways of treating addiction. And it's very different for the person, because you are changing that person from the inside out, as well as you're educating them about their outside world and the specifics of that. So it's extremely comprehensive, and the results that you get with it are miraculous. What people are able to achieve with the right tools can be incredible, the life changes that they make. It's not just about stopping the behavior, it's about the extra benefits that they get in their lives, about the changes that they make in their lives, and where those people end up being towards the end of that process. So if you want to know anything more about this, you can visit my website, which is linked below. And if you'd like to know more about the process on a personal level, you're more than welcome to contact me. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.